So Garrett, I appreciate you coming out and coming to the dojo to cover our terrain series on big woods. So welcome to the dojo.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. I love talking about this kind of stuff.
So I had put out just a question to my listeners like, hey, who do you guys think are kind of the experts in these areas? And your name came up over and over again. And the funny thing was is I actually had your name already written down. So once I saw the repeat, I was like, for sure I'll reach out. And so we I had followed you, but I don't think you weren't following me yet. And I want to tell you how cool that is that a little podcast like me reaches out to you and you take the time out of your very busy schedule to meet with us. So just really appreciate that. And I know my listeners do too, man.
Yeah, of course.
So what's interesting about this conversation, I was saying before we hit the record button, is I was a little bit nervous about this one. I've done about 30 podcasts now, and the nerves have kind of gone away at this point. But Big Woods is so foreign to me. I actually that's where I started hunting. I started off in the national forest, probably like mid Michigan, and I hunted there for 4 years, and I saw one deer. But it's I launched there, the first 4 years of really not knowing what I was doing and just getting into the game. And so it's really intimidating to me because I knew I just, it hadn't figured out. And then I transitioned from there to ag country and found success. And I've kind of bounced between like larger wooded, plots. I wouldn't call it big woods, but I've got ag, close by. I've gone out west, hunted Nebraska. I know you've been out there. I've done Missouri. And so I have a lot of fun traveling those areas. I feel really comfortable talking about that. But when it comes to this, all I can remember is the struggle that I had for 4 years while I was out there. So um, I'm really going to lean on you a lot in this podcast and let you kind of steer the conversation. The idea for the series is to kind of give that broad overview, start off there for someone who, maybe is going to the big woods their first time. I mean, who knows? Maybe they've been there for some time and have struggled, just haven't quite figured it out yet. Um, and then if we can, like, just ease it into maybe a higher, I think of the dojo, and I think belt levels, right? So we start at white belt and maybe move into, if we can get a black belt, a little tidbit of wisdom from you, that would be awesome. So I had sent you some questions before we got started today, and it was like, if this were my first season hunting big woods, what would I need to know and understand? Where should I start, and what expectations should I set? And I guess
Yeah.
before we jump in, one thing is we should probably define big woods. How would you define the conversation today?
Yeah. I wouldn't even necessarily put an acreage on it. A lot of times big woods might be, continuous blocks of 30, 40, 100,000 acres, up in the northern part of Minnesota where I live. Well, further north than when I live, even you got hundreds of thousands of acres of national and state forest land. But then you've also got areas of the state and the surrounding states that are very, very similar habitat and terrain wise, but they might be broken up into, 5,000 acres here, 600 acres there. But if you just were to walk into those woods, you wouldn't necessarily know the difference other than looking at it on a map. So I wouldn't necessarily put an acreage on it, but what seems to be a commonality between big woods, either that I've hunted, whether it's in my home area or if it's like Mark Twain in Missouri, or if it's like, I spent a little bit of time in Talladega in Alabama, or the Allegheny up in Pennsylvania. It's like the common things is that you have, at least for a large part of the year, deer feeding on just natural food sources. You don't have a ton of ag. Maybe there's some ag in peripheral areas. Maybe the larger areas of the big woods, so to speak, butts up against ag, and there's some kind of a transition zone there. Uh, but a lot of times those deer might be spending most of their time in that bigger woods area. And in terms of terrain, I mean, it could be all over the place. What I'm most familiar with is more of the rolling hill, like mixed swamp, clear cut type areas. But I know other areas of the country, like out east, maybe they have more steep terrain, or mountainous type terrain that would be considered their big woods. And I don't have a ton of experience in that type of realm. So I guess you could say, in terms of how we'll frame the conversation today, where I'm most experienced at is, we'll say, like rolling habitat, some creeks, some ponds, some clear cuts, some peripheral ag adjacent to larger areas of vast public and private. That's kind of where I am most familiar.
Yeah. Yeah, that reflects what I was hunting when I first started. Um, it was interesting when I threw out the big woods conversation and names came in. I realized how I think where you kind of grow, where you live, where you hunt, defines certain words. And so I was throwing out big woods, and people were saying, like, they were giving people who are mountain hunters were coming in,
Mm-hmm.
and it was funny because when I said big woods, I was thinking more of that flat, rolling type of terrain. I was thinking, swamp, swamp somewhere in there. So then I was like, man, I really have to make sure that I'm careful when I talk about different terrain because it means something to different people.
Yeah.
So with that big, I guess with your area that you're talking about, if I'm brand new, what do I need to know when I first walk in?
Yeah. I would say the two big things are number one, setting your expectations, and number two, learning how to tackle the landscape from a macro standpoint. And in terms of the expectations, what I would say is don't set your expectations initially anyway of, shooting a certain caliber of deer or shooting a certain number of deer. Like don't even put an end goal in terms of animal. Like that can be a bonus for your first year, but set that first year up so that you learn a lot. Even to the point of where, like, imagine if you said, I'm going to take this whole season and not even bring a weapon. I'm just going to go out in the woods all the times I normally would hunt. I mean, obviously, you can still hunt, right? But if you went into it with that mentality of, I'm only going to set up if I find something that's just so hot I can't pass it by, then you'll end up covering a lot more ground. You end up learning a lot more than if you just like say, oh, today I'm going to hunt here. And you go walk in and you hunt it. Maybe you don't see anything. Maybe the sign wasn't that great. And you could have spent that time continuing to cover miles and find the thing that actually should be hunted.
Yeah, so much more like observation, scouting going on that first year. One question I have with that is deer density, and I'm sure it's different everywhere you go around the country, but when I think of big woods, just from what I've heard in conversations and my own experience, it seemed like the deer density was lower in that type of terrain. Is that does that not kind of is I guess is that too sharp of a assessment? What is your experience when you're out in the big woods? Does it vary?
Yeah, it varies a ton.
Hmm.
It varies based off of, well, let's say even on a scale of like latitude within a given state, the closer you are to where that habitat transitions into more of like a farmland type area, you're going to have higher deer density and maybe like lower wolf density. As you get further and further north, that spectrum starts to shift to where you get lower deer density, higher predator numbers, and the least amount of ag. And that, might be the polar opposite end of the spectrum over, let's say, a couple hundred miles, if
Yeah.
that. So it really can vary, I think, quite a bit. Where I tend to try and focus on from a macro level, again, kind of lean to the second part of that last question, is I'm looking at an area of the state and then I'm trying to figure out, like, okay, where are my odds the best here? And I don't have that 40 acres that my family owns and I'm going to go there because that's what we own. And so, regardless if the hunting has sucked for the past 5 years, we're going there. I have the opportunity to say, like, well, maybe I'll hunt this county this year, or there's some land over here in this county that I really like, the features of it or the diversity or whatever it is. Or maybe this county had, a little bit of winter kill, or it had EHD or like whatever, and then you can cross that one off the list. Like I think more macro initially, and then over the years, as I've continued to build that library of places I've either scouted or hunted, that I know key areas that I can come back to, but then I'm still not like set in stone on any given particular area. The area that I shot this deer in behind me, the year after that, I had four nice mature bucks that I had located and done the scouting work on, and it was going to be a heck of a year. I was going to be happy with any one of them, and every one of those deer just kind of disappeared. It turns out, after talking to some landowners adjacent to the public I was hunting, every single one of them had died, like confirmed winter kill.
Wow.
Um, so that place basically reset. Like the year after, the biggest deer I saw on any of the trail cameras I had out was like basket racks, and I didn't
Yeah.
hunt there at all. Like I couldn't. I wasn't just gonna keep hunting it off of the memory of what that place used to be like. I'm gonna wait till it gets good again before I start hunting it. And I used that time last season to kind of spread out and scout more areas of public that I hadn't,
Mm.
previously hunted.
So that macro list that you're talking about, can we work through that a little bit of what you're looking for on the macro level?
Yeah. So you can do some type of high level research based on like either, soil type or Pope and Young, Boone and Crockett records. I tend to not hold a ton of stock into those numbers because they can just be very skewed based on the, culture of a certain area. Sometimes places that are great might not, enter their results and vice versa. And a lot of times those records are so old that they're not really that relevant anymore. It's like I want to know what the last 2 years have been like, not what it was like, in the 2000s and the 2010s. The other thing I look for a lot is diversity. And it might be a certain county has predominantly, you know, a couple of tree types and creeks running through. We'll say like dominated by like deciduous trees and, some creeks and some, beaver swamps and things of that nature. Whereas one county over, maybe you have a better mixture of some of those same evergreens, but you've also got a lot of like aspen and like very active timber cutting, a lot more water, a lot more swamps, different kinds of swamps, open swamps like wiregrass or cattail, maybe some timbered swamps like tamarack, and all of those different things that I just mentioned. It's like, man, you got this, and if those things are all pocketed, like in lots of little chunks, and that's very common throughout that landscape in that general area, then I'm going to probably say, okay, I prefer generally county A over county B. And then I can start taking a little bit closer look at county A, looking at the different areas that I can access and saying, okay, which ones of these have the most diversity? And in some instances, maybe there's like, a general transition to more of an ag area and the public is 10 miles away, let's say. And in other cases, that might not be necessarily true, but that would weigh into my decision making. Maybe County C has got more and more wolves, and you read, talk to some people who live in the area or hunt in the area, and it's like, okay, that place is clearly not doing well right now. I'll take those little bits and pieces of information and try and figure out, like, within, a 50-mile radius, like, where do I want to start spending more time actually looking at maps and figuring out where I want to, actually start putting boots on the ground. And it usually centers around diversity. If you think about it from the standpoint of, if I was going to park my truck and do an 8 mile loop, and on that 8 mile loop, I'm going to try and, to basically walk transition lines. And if I look at that spot from the truck and I'm like, well, there's my 8 mile loop, I can go hit it in one day. And that's like basically getting all the intel that I could from that spot. And then you look at another area, it's like, well, if I park my truck here, I'm going to have to make this loop. Then I'm going to have to make this loop. Then I'm going to have to make this loop. And it's like to hit every edge of swamp to hardwoods or deciduous to conifer or beaver pond line to whatever, that's the kind of area that I'm generally going to be more likely to spend more time because there's more diversity, there's more edge, deer are creatures of edge, and there's more likely to be areas that are holding deer throughout the course of an entire season in those areas that are very diverse as opposed to just like a big chunk of monoculture forest.
Yeah. The funny thing is, I think a lot of times when I think big woods, I think of that monoculture forest. Um, and almost, I mean, I'm trying to remember back to when I first started. I mean, that was just what we had. We had like one section of running pines and the other one just a section of open hardwoods and not much diversity. And it didn't, I mean, I was brand new. So at the time it didn't dawn on me to like probably go find somewhere new, you know. But
Yeah.
I think that's like this is called the Mobile Hunters Dojo. So being mobile, I think, is actually for me more so actually in the car, like driving to places that I can find success. And that's what I hear you saying as well is don't settle just because that's in your area. If you're going to hunt big woods, you really need to put the odds in your favor, put as many different, edges and diversity, together and you may have to travel and find those.
Yeah, no, exactly. How many times do you either you're talking to somebody or you read on a, Facebook messaging thread where somebody's like, "Oh, well, the place I hunt is not like that." It's like, "Well, who's telling you got to hunt there?"
Yeah.
Like, go find something better if you got the tools, and you got the experience and know-how to pick out some of these areas that people are talking about. It's like, go open up a map and find those places, put some boots on the ground. You don't have to stick with whatever you've been, growing up hunting your entire life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost better to hunt less than, and if you say, well, then I'm not gonna be able to hunt as much. It's probably better because if you're sitting in that mono, forest area, like with just one set of trees, and you're not gonna see a whole lot and have
Yeah.
too many
Yeah. I'll also
opportunities.
add too that a lot of the areas that I found that have been pretty good are not only diverse, but they're also very dense
Mm,
cover wise,
yes.
especially if you've got clear cuts that are, we'll say, between like the 3 and 12 year range, somewhere in that area where you're going to have good cover, you're going to have good food. If you've got areas of swamps, tamarack swamps or alders or what have you, then you're having a lot of cover for the deer to be able to not only have the food throughout the year, but you're also getting cover from a hunting securement standpoint where a big buck's going to be able to find that lair to just hide out during rifle season and he's not going to get shot. There was one deer that I was chasing a couple of years ago that he kind of disappeared throughout the rut and even throughout the gun season. And then the day after muzzleloader season ended, he popped up on a camera. So it was like I don't know what he did during that time frame, but he was just gone and hunkered it out. And that deer was probably already 4 years old at the time. It's like he's figured that out when he was younger, and now he can just keep doing that year after year because they have that cover. And for all we know, there's could have been guys 50 yards past him that walked right by, and he just stayed there.
Yeah.
So I like that, diversity, but also the heavy cover and as many different aspects as you can get it.
Yeah, I think when I think of heavy cover, even in the areas that I hunt, I think big deer. It gives them a place to hide and to survive. You mentioned soil type when you first were going over that list. What what soil type are you looking for, and what does it tell you?
Yeah. So the better the soil quality, and I'm not a biologist, so I definitely can't speak to this in a great level of detail, but good soil quality, good nutrients, better nutrients that make their way into the food, better nutrients that the deer can, absorb when they're feeding throughout the course of the year. And you look at, let's say, like around the Mississippi corridor where you got really great soil, great agriculture, nice, black fertile soil, and then compare that to a place in like northern Michigan where it's just like sand. You got like pine trees and sand, and you think about like the nutrients that the deer are able to pull out of that soil. And there's soil maps that you can look at for your state, and they're color coded, and they got heat maps basically of different soil types. And there's different like sandy soils and like loamy soils, and you can just kind of look at, okay, which of these soil types are common in areas that I know have really good agriculture, and then see if there's any of that in some of these areas that you're trying to look at hunting. And what I tend to find too is that you might have a little bit better diversity or more oak trees or something where the soil is a little bit better as compared to those areas where the soil is a little bit less fertile and you have more of a monoculture, because that's,
Yeah.
there's only certain trees that grow well in that environment.
Yep, that was going to be my next question, is that if you had better soil quality, you would have more diversity then.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely not a set in stone thing. Like, I think if I'm not mistaken, the Jordan buck was shot up by like far northwestern Wisconsin, like kind of by Duluth. And I don't think the soil is very good up there. And that's obviously one of the biggest deer ever.
Yeah.
So you're always going to get a unicorn that just pops up, a genetic anomaly. But, um, otherwise you're looking at age, decent genetics, and nutrition
Hmm.
in terms of what the, place is able to maintain.
When you were on that list, you talked about beaver swamps, and I hear this quite a bit when people talk about big woods. Um, can you kind of tell me how the deer and beaver swamps kind of interact together?
Yeah. A lot of times you'll find them on the edges of beaver swamps. You'll find heavy trail systems, scrape lines. You might even find if there's an actual beaver dam that the deer could cross there, especially if it's a pretty heavy, well-worn one that's got a lot of soil in it. And they make really good places for you to quickly spot check and speed scout, because you can just go up one line, back down the other, and you can get a lot of intel really fast. And the deer seem to gravitate toward them. I don't know if it's just because it's an edge, if it's because an edge and they also have a water source there, if it's because there's some kind of a thermal
Mhm.
advantage because of the water and the way that the thermals will react on that water, whether it's colder or warmer than the surrounding air and the surrounding landscape. You also have a lot of times a little bit of a dip in elevation, might not be much, might be 5 or 10 feet, but you have that along the edge of the beaver swamp. You might have thicker cover along the edges. And obviously that all plays into the whole diversity aspect. So you're going to be able to find cover if you're a deer there. You're going to be able to, you know, travel from point A to point B. There's probably going to be thick enough cover where you can bed along it. There's just a lot of advantages, I think, from a deer's perspective, especially if there's not much else around.
Mhm.
Then that beaver swamp's really going to stand out. If you've got a lot of other good places, then it might not be as strong of a draw. But generally, I always find deer sign in or around the beaver swamp type areas.
So as you're walking those edges, is there anything that you're particularly looking for? I mean, obviously, are the deer there? So, runs, probably, deer poop and stuff like that. But is there anything else that, like, what are you looking for when you're walking all those different diverse edges?
Yeah, I mean the most obvious thing to be able to see is rut sign.
Hmm.
So if a beaver swamp's going to be a good area that gets a lot of traffic, especially in like late October, November, you're going to be able to see those old rubs. You're going to be able to see scrapes. You're going to be able to see well-worn licking branches. And if you get a lot of that, then you know that the area gets good deer activity. And if you go through an area and let's say you got like a couple little spindly rubs and you covered like a couple miles, it's probably not, at least for me, like worth coming back to. If you walk down that line, cover a couple miles on some good transition along that edge, and you find, several historical rubs that are big, maybe even some of last year's rubs that are big. You find a couple licking branches where you can tell there's some good wear there. And depending on the time of year, you may or may not actually see the scrapes. If you go obviously in the spring, then you're going to be able to see those things stand out like a sore thumb. But in the summertime, you're usually only going to be able to find the licking branches if it's grown up enough around it.
Yep.
But some of the better areas that I've hunted, the rut sign is tremendous. The areas that would have like multiple big deer work in an area throughout that time period. And
Mm.
then that might not necessarily translate into the following year, but you know that area has the potential and it has the history of having it in the past.
So once we've walked in and we found our edge, we found some of the sign that you're talking about. What's our next step as a new guy coming in?
Yeah, so if you identify that it's a good area, one that is definitely worthy of putting more time in,
Hmm.
then you want to try and get as much intel as you can. The best time to do that, I think, is in the spring. I would say maybe during the season is better because it's real time and you're able to act on whatever sign you see immediately. But the second best time would be in the spring because all of the information still looks roughly the same as it did the prior fall. And if you mark as many beds as you can find, you mark those big scrapes, and the scrape lines and the scrapes, especially adjacent to bedding,
Hmm.
have always tended to produce really well, especially with daylight activity for me. So I key in on those pretty hard. The rubs are nice to see, but I don't put necessarily a ton of stock in them from a hunting standpoint. I'm looking more about like, okay, where are we seeing large congregations of beds? Maybe there's a little rise or a micro ridge or something that's got a thick clear cut on one side. There's a lot of deer that are bedding in there. I see some beds on the edges. I see a couple beds in the interior. You've got oaks on the opposite side where they didn't cut it. And then it all kind of leads down to a little beaver swamp or maybe into like an alder creek drainage type area. And you got some sign down there. Maybe there's a scrape right at the bottom. Like that type of an area, I'm looking at how does it all fit together? You might find a bedding pocket here, another bedding pocket a quarter mile away, and you're just marking everything when you're out there scouting and you pick off as much as you can chew basically in any given day. And then you go back to the map and you look at everything and you say, okay, how does this all connect? What I've tended to find with big woods is that it can be very hard to target a specific deer if you don't know exactly where he's bedding. And I think a lot of times they don't necessarily bed as predictably as they do in ag areas, let's say, for instance, where there's, one or two or three best bedding areas in a given landscape,
Hmm.
or even hill country where you find those really worn into to the dirt beds. I don't find as many of those. I do find some of them in the swampy areas. If you've got like a big tamarack root ball, it's like, man, this thing's been a bed for decades. Um, but that buck might only be bedded there for certain portions of the year. And maybe when he's there, he's bedding there like 3 days a week for like a, 10-day span, and then he's not using it anymore. But over the years, it's got so much use that it just looks like he's been there all the time. So beds and early season patterns I've found to be tougher to be able to capitalize on. So a lot of times, if I'm going to be putting all my eggs into, the greater basket, it's usually like mid-October through Thanksgiving timeframe is going to be the best opportunity to be able to capitalize. And also late season potentially, depending on how the area sets up. Because a lot of times those deer could pocket into certain areas late season. And if they don't get much hunting pressure and if your season goes into January, then you can be able to capitalize on that. But it's obviously much harder because there's less cover for you. The deer are on edge. It's really hard to get away with movement. There's a lot of things that make that type of hunting harder. So I usually find the best success and a lot of daylight activity with the bigger deer in an area from mid-October through November. And the more consistent timing tends to be like the 3rd and 4th week of October. And once you flip into November, you're still going to get those daylight sightings, but they're a lot less predictable.
Mm-hmm.
It might be like November 6th, a giant showed up on this trail camera at 11 in the morning, and November 15th, this other giant showed up on this camera at 2 in the afternoon. But it's like trying to pick that out on being in the right place at the right time is just a matter of chance. Whereas you can get a little bit more predictability in that 3rd, 4th week of October. You can line up the weather right and be in one of those areas that they're likely to be daylighting in. So that's usually what I try to capitalize on when I'm thinking about my whole season.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I focus on some of those areas that I was describing when scouting. I know they're the type of areas that I'm ultimately going to be hunting come the fall.
Yeah. Yeah. If you were going to go in early season, um, I would imagine oaks, like if that would be, if you have oaks in that area, I would imagine that would be a pull for them if there's no ag close by. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah.
Yeah. Like if you have, let's say, a lot of red oaks generally, and then you have a couple ridges that have white oaks on them, or you
Mm-hmm.
have certain areas of swamp where you got little pockets of bur oaks or white oaks, then yeah, definitely try to capitalize on those. You can usually, from what I've seen, if you're trying to like just put meat in the freezer, you can usually get on does pretty easily with that kind of a pattern early
Mm-hmm.
season.
Mm-hmm.
Clear cuts too. I've seen a lot of really good early season movement within clear cuts that are of the right age, with doe movement especially. And you might get that random like big buck that kind of cruises through early, especially in August. Seems like they'll just like make a random pass or two, but then they don't really come back into those areas, in my experience, until like mid-October.
Wow.
And it might be at night usually, unless you get a really good like weather pattern that comes through. So yeah, early season can be good. I just haven't had much success early season for specific like bigger deer.
Yeah.
I've definitely had better success with daylight sightings later October.
So can we move into that later October timeframe then
Mm-hmm.
and kind of discuss what's going on there in a little bit more detail and how to set up? Before I do that, I'm going to ask you a really vague question. And it might not be easy to answer, but how do you prefer to set up? And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail when you're in the woods. Are you using I would imagine it's a variety of things, but are you using a tree stand, a saddle, a climber, or hunting? I know you hunt from the ground, um, but does Big Woods set up to favor one of those over the other, or is it all situational? Depends on where you're at.
Yeah, I'd say the only thing that I don't use really much at all is a climber, just
Yeah.
because I mean, there's places that I've hunted where it could work, but the odds are not in the favor of climbers in terms of finding a good tree to be able to use. And I'll typically, I'll say 80% of the time, maybe 90% of the time, I'm using either a saddle or hunting on the ground.
Yep.
And that's 100% dictated by the setup.
Hmm.
And there are those scenarios where a tree stand I think makes more sense. Like let's say if there's one really good spruce tree and it's like right downwind of a scrape and it's like I got to be in that tree, the cover would be great, but I'd have to saw off like 6 limbs to really be able to effectively hunt out of a saddle, or like, kind of set up to where I'm looking behind me most of the day. In a scenario like that, I'd pick to use the tree stand as the right tool for the job. But typically if I'm elevated, I'm hunting out of a saddle and then, off the ground, especially in like clear cut type areas where you don't have a lot of good tall trees. And the ones that are there, usually you can't shoot down really much because
Hmm.
all of the shorter trees around it create so much of an obstruction. And especially if you got like ferns and briars and maybe even some deadfall, like that can give you really good ground cover to be able to work with. And the ground setup makes a lot of sense in that scenario.
Yeah. The reason I that was a loaded question really for Michigan because what I've noticed in upper northern Michigan, a lot of people that I know and that I grew up with when we first started hunting, and I think they still do, they were really like dedicated to the climber. And I really felt like even for my situation, it kept me out of being able to get into where I really needed to get in. I didn't know better back then, but I'm all for these conversations about breaking up the norm about what we always use, because I think it kind of pigeonholes people. So I love the fact that you are using every tool necessary and um, you know to set up, including the ground. I'm more and more interested in ground hunting. I haven't done it yet, but it's definitely on my list. Try to break away free from even the tools that I use. I kind of go from saddle to tree stand, but okay, so now we're heading into mid-October, and maybe, and if you want to go somewhere else with it, that's fine. What is your ideal setup during that time frame? Like if you could paint a picture, what would it look like?
So my ideal setup might be downwind of either a scrape or a scrape line, and I have something behind me that creates some sort of a barrier. Let's say it's a beaver swamp,
Mhm.
some kind of swampy or watery enough area where I know typically the deer don't go into it or cross through it, even though they probably could if they wanted to. Where we have some kind of a little role in the topography as well, and some sort of bedding out in front of me.
Mhm.
And what I've seen in many instances is that you might have does, let's say, bedding on a hillside, and you got that beaver swamp behind you, and the bucks will travel that corridor between the two. They feel secure because really you can't see anything beyond that corridor. You can't really see into the bedding. There's not really much happening out in the beaver swamp. And then along that corridor, I used to think that bucks would just, it would be a big scrape line. Let's say a quarter mile long. You got scrapes, all up and down it. I used to think that a deer would just start at one end and then it would go travel the whole thing. But I've since observed that what they actually do in many scenarios is they'll be in that bedding cover and they'll pop out and they'll walk along that scrape line for like 50 yards, 100 yards or something, and they'll pop back in on a different trail. I've seen that happen enough now to make me think that, like, okay, that tends to be the norm. And you can see it too if you have like a trail camera on this end and a trail camera on this end, and you never hardly ever get deer that show up on both. Occasionally it'll happen, but more often you're just getting like one camera that'll get hit.
Yeah.
So I like that scenario a lot because it tends to be not too bad for me to get in there, and I usually have a pretty decent wind advantage, especially if it's like an evening sit. I can kind of get in there a little bit late, especially if the let's say the sun is going down in the southwest and I've got a little bit of shade on that hill to where when I get in there, I don't really have too much of an upward thermal lift. I've got the pond behind me that if it's, a little bit warmer, that could be pulling some thermals too. So wind tends to be not too bad. And I can just sit there in that tree and I can just watch deer after deer after deer go by and not get busted.
Mm.
Uh, that tends to be, and it's still a guessing game, right? It's not like I say, okay, this buck's gonna show up. He's been on the trail camera like the last 3 days, and I'm gonna go in and shoot him. Like that never happens in reality. It's more like I'm hunting probabilities. Like this deer, the last 3 years has gone through this spot and hit this scrape line on average, let's say like 2 to 4 days a week. If I hunt that spot 4 days in a row with the same exact conditions, I'm likely to get a crack at either that deer at some point or one of the other ones in the area. And if I got two or three in an area, like that's all the better, but stacking the odds in my favor. But what I like to do is I'll take some of those photos or just general observations, and I use the Spartan Forage app a lot in their journaling tab for this type of stuff. I'll load in, this deer, and I'll put in whatever that specific deer was. If it was the big nine or like whatever, and it'll geotag the conditions and the location. So then when I'm looking at those entries, whether it's a trail camera photo or whether it's an observation, and I'm looking at that the following year or 2 years later, I can look at those dates and those upcoming dates and say, like, this area might not be a specific deer, it might be a specific area. Like this scrape line, October 17th or 23rd, like I better be there because no matter what deer it is, Like that area just seems to light up that time, whether it's a doe that comes in heat early in that area or whatever. And then I'll use that information like as upcoming, like the week ahead, and I'll look at the weather forecast and the prediction and that sort of thing to be able to try and fine tune that a little bit. Because I generally don't want to hunt just for the sake of hunting.
Mm-hmm.
I'd rather stay out until I think the conditions are going to be right. And then I won't be afraid to hunt that same spot 3, 4, 5 days in a row.
Yeah, I was just getting ready to ask, a lot of conversation lately, how we get in trends when we talk about different hunting tactics is that like hunt it once or twice and then you're on to another piece. And I just can't see that being effective in the big woods. Like, I mean, maybe it could be if you had certain kind of data, but I would imagine like what you just said, you'd have to sit for 3, 4, 5 days to try to catch that pattern
Yeah.
of that movement.
Yeah. I mean, early season or areas where you have more specific patterns, whether it's ag country or hill country
Hmm.
or whatever, then yeah, I'm generally not hunting the same place twice,
Same.
unless it's during the rut and I'm hunting like a pinch point. But
Hmm.
early season, it's like, yeah, I'm almost never hunting the same tree twice. But I've just seen enough instances of these pre-rut patterns, and especially during the rut, but even during the pre-rut, of if I just pick one day, like the odds are not that good. But that deer didn't come in, you know, like he's not coming in every day.
Hmm.
Right. So I don't have to be afraid of me setting up and then leaving and then him coming in an hour after dark, smelling that I was there, and then not coming back the next day. It's usually not that type of pattern. It's usually like he's going to be here, most likely, if he's still alive. And I just got to be there when he does.
Hmm. Do you find that deer bedding or doe bedding is set up in areas that are consistent with a food source that is year after year? So what I mean by that is oaks can be hit or miss. Like, you could be here one year and not the next. But there may be some browse that is in the area that's consistently comes up every year. Um, do you find that bedding is more aligned with that, or does it have maybe no rhyme or reason? Does it change each year and you have to go find the bedding each time you go out?
No, at least in the areas I hunt, I seem to find fairly predictable bedding.
Hmm.
The oaks might be hit or miss, like you said. So there might be some, like throughout that time period, there might be some shifts. But if there's browse in an area, whether it's because there's a 2 or 3 year old clear cut,
Hmm.
or whether there's a lot of briars in a hillside, or if there's just other mast in that area, then that's going to provide predictable food for a long period of time. If a place gets logged out, and then you've got this span where you have weeds the first year, and then gradually that starts to turn into sticks and saplings, and then the aspens start to kind of dominate, and you got thorns and briars and ferns underneath. And then eventually they start to get big enough where you start to lose some of that undergrowth a little bit. Like throughout that whole time period, you've got really predictable food and you've got good predictable cover. So if I come back to an area that used to be really good like that 10 years later, maybe it's no good anymore.
Hmm.
But if you find that area while it's still good, then you can come back to that year after year and tend to find that similar pattern, is what I've seen.
What other browse away from a clear cut have you seen that deer are attracted to out in the big woods?
Um, early season, gosh, it seems like they eat so much, and a lot of it I don't even couldn't even tell you
Yeah.
what the name is. Um, but I know if you have it, like stinging nettles, they seem to be a fan of. Um, Usually like any kind of briars. I don't know if they're eating that specifically or just like general plants around them.
Mhm.
I tend to see a lot of feeding activity there. If you have swampy areas, I know like at certain times of year, probably people have seen like the hunting public videos where they showed like the duck potato or the hunting beast
Mhm.
videos where they talk about the arrowhead. But I've also seen like dogwood areas, especially late season, can be a big draw where you might not find like the woods might be cleared out. If you find that alder swamp and you got dogwood and evergreen and
Mhm.
whatever else, like the deer are just tucked into there and they're able to feed on, whatever they can find in there in terms of woody browse. So it seems like instead of trying to pick out something specific, I'll just look for the sign and be like,
Mhm.
whatever they're eating here, like they're here.
Yeah.
And if I can start taking pictures and notes, and usually I'm pretty good of like putting a mental picture together of like this seems like it should be good and I'm not picking out specific things per se, but my subconscious is remembering like what I've seen in the past and saying like, okay, this you've seen areas like this before that were really good. Like be on the lookout for specific deer sign and clippings of browse where they're nibbling off at little above ground level and droppings and tracks and
Mhm.
things of that nature. Especially early season, if I'm doing a scouting loop, you might not find the tracks per se because there's no dirt really exposed at that time of year unless you're in a swampy area, and then you can go to those wet areas and be able to see pretty obviously if there's been deer moving through it or not. But sometimes you might just find like the depression in the grass and the dew, or you might just see the tops of the little weeds and plants that are clipped off that the deer are eating those. So
Mhm.
that type of stuff takes a keen eye.
Mhm.
If you ever have the luxury of being able to scout with somebody that's really good at picking up on that type of stuff, that's the best way to learn. If you don't have that, then you just got to spend a lot of time in the woods and absorb as much information as you can and try to get better at picking that stuff up. But like the instances where I've hunted with guys like Johnny Stewart, for instance, and I'm just like sitting behind him and just like seeing what he does and like what he picks out. And he's all like, that guy's always telling me like what he sees and what he likes and doesn't like. And you learn more just like standing behind somebody and just taking it in and be like, okay, mental note, mental note, mental note. And you can learn a lot of information you can apply almost immediately. So I would just encourage any of the listeners, if you have an opportunity like that, definitely, you know, take somebody up on it and go learn from other people that have as much or more experience as you do. So you can pick up that firsthand information. Even in a video format, it's really hard to pick up some of
It
that type of
is.
stuff.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. What I did, I don't hunt close to home. I go out of state and hunt different states throughout the year. But last year and the year before, I just really scouted a ton around my house just to kind of look for those micro, pieces of sign. So because I was scouting not to actually hunt, I found myself having more time. I didn't rush it because I didn't feel like I had to cover the whole area. So I was able to just kind of sit around. I remember a couple times I would just take a seat, either on the log or lean against a tree and just gaze for a little while and try to find what was different than what I've maybe seen in the past. And I, started finding some of that micro sign of these little nips and stuff like that. The other part about your answer that I love that you didn't actually go through and give us a list of things that deer eat because you're looking for the sign. The sign tells you what they're eating in that location. I asked that question because I get that question a lot from the listeners. Hey, what's a list of things that deer are eating? And I think the best answer is the sign will tell you in that area. So look for the sign. That's
Yeah.
so good.
Yeah. Although if having a list is something that gives somebody an excuse to slow down so they
Uh,
can start to identify stuff, and that slowing down is what's causing them to take a little bit keener eye, and then they start to pick up some of these things, then that could definitely be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I think the list is actually a little bit easier in ag country and stuff like that. I think,
Yeah.
you can have those. Um, but yeah, that's a good point. So heading back to mid-October there, you're hunting scrapes. Anything else? Any part of well, maybe I should also talk about you had mentioned trail cams a couple times.
Mhm.
What is your trail cam strategy? I mean, and do you change it for the time of year that you're going to be hunting?
So yes to the second part, usually.
Hmm.
If it's a late season, then I'm doing a scouting loop, preferably when there's snow, and just trying to relocate them to wherever I think I'm going to get pictures, not necessarily where I would hunt, but along the same travel pattern, so that when I feel comfortable that like, oh, okay, there's deer moving here early enough that if I get close enough to where I actually want to hunt, they're probably gonna be moving in daylight. Or if there's like a certain specific deer, it's like, oh, there he is. Like, okay, I had that piece of information now. Then certainly moving the cameras around for that is beneficial. But a lot of times, if I am, let's say, setting up cameras for that specific pre-rut into rut strategy, I'll put them in usually two types of locations. One will be those scrapes, and I'll try to locate them in the best scrapes I can find. So instead of like putting one every 200 yards on scrapes that you find, it might be like, okay, I scouted this 1,000 acres. And of those, there's like 4 scrapes that are just like money. I'll just put cameras on those because what I usually see is that even though the movements aren't hyper predictive and you're not always going to get pictures on those, special cameras like on any given day compared to any of the other scrapes you could have put them on, usually you're going to get enough variety hitting those scrapes so you at least have an idea of what's in the area. And you're usually going to get a lot of deer activity on those, whether it's does, fawns, black bears, coyotes, other people walking through. Like they just tend to be very hyper active camera locations. You're going to get a lot of photos. And usually throughout the course of a year, you're going to get multiple of the, bucks that you have in those areas. And so if a certain buck shows up on 2 of the cameras that I have out there, and they show up on those a lot, and occasionally show up on like a third one, and then my 4th camera has like a totally different set of deer that are hitting it, it's like, okay, now I can start to sort of bracket where these deer's home ranges are and where they like to travel. And that's information that can be, again, really helpful in the future years. A lot of times the trail cameras aren't helping me out the year that I'm putting them out and getting the pictures. They're helping me out for future intel.
Yeah.
And that can be tough too, because you can't guarantee a deer's going to make it through. But if you get enough of that intel, then you can kind of, again, play the odds in your favor that, if you have 5 that you'd be happy to shoot and 3 of them made it through, then you got pretty good odds. You got 3 of them you can go after.
Can you describe what a money scrape looks like to you?
Yeah. A lot of it has to do with context. Not necessarily the scrape itself, what it looks like, although that can tend to be, a good indicator as well. But what is that scrape connecting? What different pockets of bedding are surrounding it? What hard or soft transition lines is it connecting? What travel areas are there? What can a deer smell if he's sitting at that scrape location? Some of the best ones that I've found have been in areas where, let's say it's like on the corner of a pond. And so you got a hard transition on one side. Then you got a good corridor along that pond. And then there's a ridge dropping down there that's got great doe bedding. And then around the other side of that lake, you've got another pocket of bedding. And then that corridor kind of sneaks between the two and leads to some other bedding like a half mile away. And then that one location is going to be a good sun checking location for deer. It's also going to be a good travel location. It's going to be an area where they can feel secure. If that area has also got some sort of, it's not just wide open, but there's good heavy cover there, maybe some blowdowns or, clear cuts that are intermixed there where they can feel secure. I have had individual scrapes where between October 17th and I think like November 10th, I think there was a buck 2-year-old or older every day during daylight, except for like maybe 2 days during that span. And those areas aren't necessarily easy to hunt, right? Like getting into that spot is like a nightmare without getting your scent everywhere. There's just like only certain ways you can get in there. And so it's kind of like an, all or nothing when you go in. And then again, like hitting that on the exact time where a big one comes through is not great. So it's like, well, I'm going to get it 3 good days hard. And then like my scent's going to be all over there. Deer size are going to go down. So it's like, if it doesn't happen during those first 3 days, like I probably blew that spot out. And then you go on to plan B. But from an intel standpoint, those types of scrapes can be really good in terms of what they look like when you're actually there. Seems like a lot of times what I find is when I'm scouting, I might be following a deer trail through some kind of thick corridor, and the understory will just kind of open up, and you kind of pause and look around. You're like, oh, there's the scrape. Yeah. It's like a lot of times there's those little micro pockets within cover. It seems like so commonly, and if you are scouting in late spring when you don't have the snow or the foliage yet, then it becomes even that more obvious because you can see the pod out area on the ground that like can even attract your attention from 50 yards away. But then once you get up close, there's always going to be a good looking branch if it's a good scrape. And in a lot of cases, it's not just one scrape. It might be a pocket where within like a 30-yard radius, you've got like 2 or 3 individual licking branches and scrapes all kind of intermixed there. Or you might have a tree that's kind of hanging sideways and it's like you got a couple scrapes like all right next to each other, almost like one long scrape. And those can be really good too. But the commonality there is there's always good licking branches. It might be one thicker stem, like, the size of your thumb or finger that's just kind of like shredded. But a lot of times what I find too is that you might just have like a branch that's kind of snapped off and you got like 15 little twigs, basically. They're just kind of dangling there. Those tend to get hit really good as well. I got a video on my YouTube channel of a scrape that I hunted for like 2 days in a row. And I think there was like 7 or 8 different bucks that came through. Not all of them were big, but every one of them came through and hit that licking branch. And, one of those deer just kind of went up and just worked around, was pawing, like got great footage for, probably 45 seconds, a minute before he walked off. And every deer that was going through there was hitting that licking branch, but not every one of them pawed the scrape out. So they're all using that from a scent perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And in that particular location, you didn't really have a lot of deer circling downwind of the scrape because there was a hard barrier there. Like they weren't going out into the water to go downwind of that scrape. They were just staying basically right there. So they were either going right beneath my tree or they were going right along the scrape line. But if you're out in a more open type of area, it might be more common for those bigger deer to circle 40, 60, 80 yards downwind of the scrape, and then you get busted because they smell you.
Yeah. Yeah. When you were describing that scrape location, it sounded to me, I was thinking of like a hub scrape in ridge country where you have multiple bedding areas and different, kind of to the east and to the west and, over on the south, and everything kind of meets here in the bottom. It kind of reminded me of that. I wonder if you drew a line to the different bedding and the different type of, like even the beaver dam and all of that, if it would look similar to like a spoke.
Yeah, they definitely can. I'll throw out a term that I learned from Brian Dombrowski, who scouts a lot of similar, like, bigger woods, Wisconsin type area,
Mhm.
where he'll call it like a bedding complex,
Yeah.
where he's not necessarily saying like he's got bedding, specific beds that he's after, but like this 2 acre pocket is like a bedding complex. You're going to walk through there at any given time and you're going to bump deer out. They might not always be in the same beds. It might not always be the same deer, but there's always deer bedding there because of the cover and the way it lays out in the terrain. And if you were to look at a 10,000 foot view, maybe not that high up, you're just looking at like, several hundred yards radius. You say, okay, I got a bedding complex here, 1 acre. And then there's like another quarter acre where I've seen deer bed as well. And there's like 3 acres of really good cover over here where deer are bedding. And you kind of take those little different complexes and draw lines between them and then kind of bend those lines to be able to match the terrain and how the deer would actually travel through the terrain with the different transitions and pinch points and whatever. And then you'll find there will be those little, pinches or connection points or hubs between those different bedding areas, especially like doe bedding areas commonly. Because a lot of times you can go in there in September and you'll find tons of does that are there right then and there. But then like mid-October, then the bucks start moving in. They start to move to more of that rut bedding location, and they're spending a lot of time in that area as well.
Mhm. Yeah, you talked about being able to watch somebody scout. I got to go with Brian and
Oh, okay.
watch him scout, and it was awesome. Yeah, and he's been on our podcast a couple times and talked about the bedding complexes, and I actually stole that terminology from him and started using it. But yeah, he's a great guy. By the way, he said hi. He told me to tell you to say hi. But so anything else on that mid-October? We talked, okay, that you're putting trail cameras out on those four scrapes, kind of learning the different territories if they overlap or if they're, one buck's hitting a couple different cameras and not this one, and you're starting to see a different pattern. Anything else around that general time frame that you think would be key for someone to understand?
um, Two things. One being awning pressure, one being pinch points. Usually we don't talk about pinch points until like full on rut,
Mm-hmm.
where you're just spending dark to dark, sits in a tree, and you're hoping that that big one walks by at any given point. But I've actually gotten a lot of sightings and trail camera photos in areas that don't have scrapes. They don't even necessarily have rubs, but they're in really good like outside bends or pinch point type areas where a deer can cross through from like one bedding area to another and stay pretty secluded. And sometimes I'll get pictures of bucks crossing through those areas and they're not hitting like the scrapes adjacent to it. It's like they're just going from point A to point B. They use that area. It might seem like obvious, but there might not be any hunter sign there. And sometimes those areas can be really good. So I don't always just feel like I have to be sitting on a scrape because I've also seen enough instances in where just sitting on those better pinch points could be worth a sit. Absolutely. Even outside of the rut, we'll say December 10th, I've seen some of these areas be like really good for daylight sightings. where you wouldn't have expected it otherwise. There's not like really a lot of rutting activity going on then, but the deer are still traveling the way that they're traveling through that landscape.
Mhm. Can you give some examples of pinch points in the big woods?
Yeah. You'll oftentimes find water-based pinch points, and to a lesser extent, like hardwood to softwood type transitions, or like clear cut to hardwood
Mhm.
transitions, or some kind of vegetative edge. A deer might be like cutting a corner across one of those, but the ones that I find that tend to be pretty good are like the water-based
Mhm.
pinch points, where again, deer probably could cross through the water. There's nothing physically preventing them from doing so, but it seems like more often than some of these bigger, flatter big woods areas, as compared to like marsh country where they're traveling through water and marsh all the time. Seems like a lot of times they'll just walk around as often or more often than they'll cut through,
Mhm.
is what I tend to see.
Yep.
Especially if it's like, again, kind of that downward slope into that swampy or watery area, then they feel really secure because if it's a early morning or late evening, they got that thermal draw coming down. They feel pretty safe in terms of like what's happening or not happening out in the swamp, and they can stay hidden kind of like low out of sight and then cut through some of those areas pretty securely.
Yeah, it doesn't take much elevation for that to happen, right? Like, I mean, it's 10 foot drop and they feel pretty good, pretty comfortable, maybe even less than that.
Yeah. Yeah. And the second piece of that is the hunting pressure. I mean, that can, as with any place, it tends to be not as bad with big woods compared to other habitat types. But if a certain area, a certain city or whatever's got a reputation and the locals know about it, it's produced, big deer over the years, then people will know about it. They've been probably hunting there for decades. They know where a lot of the good spots are, and hunting pressure can still be a pretty strong factor. Then you have to take a lot of like what I'm saying, but also think of it from the lens of the hunting pressure aspect, just like you would with any other terrain type. Maybe you
Mhm.
won't be able to hunt those specific spots. Um, Maybe you have to find the spot where the deer are not having that direct scent because some guy's checking the trail cameras or cutting through an area to scout or whatever and put a lot of human scent on. You got to find those areas where the deer are not being harassed to
Mhm.
still get that good daylight sighting and to generally be a little bit more mobile in those scenarios.
Yep. All right. So moving on to the rut time period. Um, I guess what for you, what is that if you give it a date, like start and finish, what is that rut time for you?
From, we'll say November 1st through like the 15th.
Hmm.
I'll say the 15th in a state like Wisconsin, and I'll say like the 20th or 21st in a state like Minnesota or North Dakota.
Is that because the gun
Just
season's
because of that
later?
rifle season
Yep.
timing, because that definitely throws a loop around things. I've gone and had, you know, good sightings in like I killed a deer in North Dakota on I think the 18th or 19th, and their rifle season was in, but they rifle hunt different than they do in Wisconsin. And so there wasn't a whole lot of activity happening in the woods where I was at. And you were still getting a lot of good rut activity that late. In fact, I killed that deer over a couple of active scrapes that had been opened up in the snow. And with a state like Wisconsin, it seems like you got good rut activity even through like that 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, very segmented, but like absolutely if you're spending time in the tree, like there could be that opportunity of a giant walking through, um, all the way basically up to the opening gun season. And then, I mean, after that, you're still good potentially, but it's a different, the hunting pressure there, you got to just have a different strategy.
Yep.
But what I tend to see is like if we put it in maybe not necessarily phases, but like a spectrum is that like October 31st through like November 3rd ish, it's kind of like a blend. Like you might see some of that pre-red activity. You might see a deer just like, full bore, flying through chasing a doe. But as you get later and later, the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and especially into like the early teens of November, it seems like that's usually when I get like the random roamer that'll just like pop up out of nowhere. Just that like straight leg, walk and he's just covering ground. But I don't see as much of that earlier in that
Mhm.
November or October 30th, 31st, 1st, 2nd. much more likely to see a buck just like on a doe, like running her around, um, or like actively checking the scrapes, being really aggressive, tearing stuff up. Um, so you got to spend time in the woods either way. And I would tend to say that like on the earlier side of that spectrum, I'm more hunting those scrape like areas that we talked
Mhm.
about. And as it gets later and later, I'm more likely to start shifting to just general pinch points. Could be the edge of a swamp, where I know they like to cruise on the edge up and down if there's like a lot of doe, especially if you got like a, let's say there's a hardwood edge and then it transitions into swamp. But then in that swamp, there's like pockets of timber, tamarack, spruce, or whatever, and there's a lot of does that bed out in those little pockets. A lot of times I've seen where bucks will just like cruise right up that hardwood line, especially if you got the wind kind of blowing out of there. And they have a really good knack of being able to walk through like the thickest line where you can't get a shot through anything. But that could be a good area to be able to set up and get activity. Or areas where you just have a lot of stuff mixing at one spot. It could be like a corner of a beaver drainage where maybe it's not even a pond, but it's just like a seepage, like a little creek, like where if you walked up to it, it's like, oh, it's only like 3 feet across, and you take a step and you sink down to your waist, and that kind of ends. And then you've got a clear cut that starts up at the top of it, and then it's like spruce swamp behind you, but then there's like a little strip of hardwood timber like in between all of that, and you've just got like multiple lines of travel where those deer are going through. That can be one of those areas where you could see like deer every day if you sat on it.
Yep.
So those like hyper diverse little pockets or pinch points tend to be what I look for in big woods, as opposed to like, if hill country, you're looking at more of the terrain based stuff. You
Hmm.
might not have that, so you're looking for more of the diversity based edge.
Yeah. You talked about kind of that spruce bedding and them being tight and kind of weaving in through there. So are you setting up real tight to that edge then? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I made the mistake one year of sticking up where I had the edge of a clear cut, and then maybe like 60 yards of blowdown and timber, and then there was the edge of that swamp. And I thought because of the wind direction, I'd be a little bit safer sitting toward the clear cut. And sure enough, a big deer that I was after went right down that line. And I tried snort wheezing at him. He just, silently bounded off into the swamp. But had I been sitting on that edge that particular day, I maybe could have killed that buck. But I've also scouted that edge, and it's like, man, I don't even know what tree I could set up in. And you can't set up on the ground because it's too thick on the ground. There's too much. I mean, definitely you could figure it out. And there's probably one tree that I could have used. It's not like a gimme type shot, but one that you could probably make it happen.
Hmm.
But point being, like that's part of why that edge tends to be so good. And a lot of the trails that you'll see there are going in and out, not necessarily along, perpendicular, but that's where I've seen a lot of times those bucks walk, unless they're doing like what we talked about before, where they're going into the doe bedding, then popping out someplace else, and then walking up 50, 100 yards and then going back in.
Yeah. So I would imagine like if you're observing that, then you're making a move. You're kind of, if you set up over here and you're watching this weaving going in and out in a certain area, it's getting down and readjusting.
Yep.
Do you find yourself when you find those areas that almost seem impossible to hunt? Is that kind of a clue of like that's where I need to be?
Yeah. I mean, there definitely is a correlation there. If a deer's hard to kill and he's got a good scent advantage, especially, like that's part of the reason that he's probably gotten that big to begin with. And there's sometimes instances in where maybe it isn't even the best spot. Maybe it's an area you should get busted in, but you just happen to get lucky because the wind happened to not drift the wrong way at the wrong time, and you were able to get a shot off. And every time that happens, you might have the opposite scenario of where you're like, oh, I hope I can pull it off, and then the wind switches at just the wrong time. Because even with the thermals and the wind, the winds generally moving through an area, you still might not have predictable winds by any
Mhm.
stretch of the imagination.
Yeah.
So you're always just kind of, again, playing the probabilities. And if I get busted because 10% probability of a wind going a certain direction happens at the wrong time, like it is what it is. Like I'm not going to be able to find something that's absolutely perfect.
I feel like with the woods, you have to be kind of pinpoint with it. Like you have to be in a right on the spot. It it feels like it's so easy to set up too far away because the pinch points in my mind, unless, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but when I think of a pinch point, like especially when I'm hunting ridges, like, I get on a drainage, like I can get that pinch point right down to the, a couple feet. Like I know where they're going to cross. And so it makes it a lot easier. Even when I'm thinking of, you know, even in country again, when there's like bedding and then it comes out like on top where the does are bedding and it comes down to where the ridge starts to drop. I can kind of predict that downwind run pretty easily. I can see it easily. There's a lot of things that pinch deer right to almost where you want them. In the woods, in the big woods, it seems like that would be harder to do. It would to kind of also, like, I guess what I'm saying is like it's easier to see. I also feel like I don't need to be right on it because it's easier to shoot. I can kind of on ridge country. It's not necessarily it's more topography. It's not necessarily how thick it is that's going to dictate some of the movement there. I tend to like thick stuff. I tend to even gravitate towards that there, but I can get longer shots if I need to. In the woods, I guess you could too, but it just seems like they could be so far away from you. Is that something that is learned over time, or am I wrong? Is it actually no, Matt? Once you get into these pinch points, you'll see like they'll actually be in a very specific area.
Yeah, I mean, you won't always nail it, but what I've seen a lot of times is if you're in a thick enough area, especially, you're either going to get a 15-yard shot or you're not going to get a shot.
Hmm.
Like there's a trail and there's a scrape line and like, oh man, he went right through the thicket and I could see his rack moving through there, but like there's no way he could have got a shot in there anyway. And if he does go on the trail that you're actively hunting, it's going to be a chip shot. Like that's a lot of times the areas that I'm in, I'm either going to get a really point blank shot on a location that I'm very specifically hoping they show up in, or I'm just not going to have a shot opportunity. And certainly there's other areas that are a little bit more open. There's always the chance that they could go by at 60, 80 yards or whatever. But I'm usually not hunting in an area where I can just see a deer moving through the woods 100 yards away. It's just usually not the type of area I'm targeting.
That's what I was searching for when I was trying to explain it. That answer is that I feel like the temptation in big woods is to want to set up where you could see, even with a bow. I think somebody who's less experienced in that situation may want to see more. Um, and that actually might be okay on that first year that you're talking about when you're observing and trying to collect data. But if you're going to be in the game, it is these tighter, thicker areas within the hardwoods that the bucks are going to be using to travel.
Yeah. Yeah. Even like rifle hunting, you know, then you really have the temptation to be able to set up where you can see a little bit longer because you can shoot a little bit longer. But I don't think of the deer I've shot with a rifle, which it's not that many, definitely not nearly as many as with a bow. Like I think the longest shot I've ever taken is like 60 yards.
Yeah.
And more commonly it's like 12 yards. Like last year, 2 deer I shot with a rifle were like 28 yards and 13. It's
Yeah.
just like, again, I'm setting up in similar areas that I would be like, because I think the deer are going to be there because of the cover and like everything else. It's not that I'm actively searching out an area that I feel like I can see a long ways.
Yeah. So when you're hunting these pinch points, I heard you earlier, you said dark to dark, during the rut time period. Um, how many days are you, and I'm sure it's dependent, but how many days are you sitting in those pinch points?
Mm, could be like, usually we'll say like 3 to 4.
Hmm.
Depends on, I mean, I don't just take off 2 weeks. Like usually, especially with work, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to take these 4 days off and then I'm going to work for like 3 days and catch up. And then, so I'm trying to plan out the weather for like best days to be in the field. So usually it's somewhat dictated by that. But even if I wasn't doing that, I feel like I would need to switch every couple of days just to prevent myself from going stir crazy. There's enough spots to go around when you get to like just general patterns during the rut where you're just trying to catch that random mover. That staying mentally strong is as important to as anything. So you can stay in the woods and kind of be alert and be ready. So yeah, usually we'll say like 2 to 3 days maybe, unless the wind changes. If the wind
Hmm.
changes, I might say, okay, I'm gonna hunt this area this day, and then if the wind changes like it's supposed to, I'm gonna hunt in this other spot regardless of what I saw or didn't see that day.
Mhm.
So you got to be, smart about it from that standpoint too.
Yep. Anything else on that rut time period?
Don't be afraid to not see anything. It's gonna happen. I mean, you think about how much land the deer have to move, and once those does start going into heat, you know that somewhere out there's a party going on, and it's not at your tree. But as those does cycle in and out, you're gonna have movement of a deer, leaving one doe and going to find the next one. And so if you can be there at that point in time, then that could be all it takes to make your season. So just knowing that you can't get yourself discouraged because you might have spent like 2 days and not really seen much, maybe like, one spike or something that goes through, doesn't necessarily mean that you're in a bad spot or that your season's over or whatever. Trying to stay mentally engaged, move if you have to keep yourself mentally fresh, but still, be smart, think about where the deer are going to be moving, think about how they might use the wind to their advantage to be able to set track certain areas. So
So the most like common question about the rut, if you had a week to take off, what's the dates that you're taking off?
hmm. If I have good intel in an area, I would take off the last week of October.
Ah,
Like if I have good historical, like let's say 2, 3 years of data, I know where they like to go. I've got trees that are already picked out that I, know exactly how I'm going to climb them. Like I got these places ready to go. It's just a matter of timing. Then I like that last week of October from the predictability standpoint, the daylight movement, whatever else. Plus, none of those bucks have usually been killed by that point in time. By the time November 15th
mhm,
rolls around, maybe two of them are dead. Um, but if I didn't have that week, I would say if you're after just any general deer, not necessarily like a big one, then that first week, maybe even like, I don't know, the 2nd through 9th of November could be
mhm,
pretty good. But then it seems like if you're after, the biggest ones out there, then the low odds, but maybe the best odds is like later in the rut,
mhm.
like after a lot of those does have been bred. And you're looking at like, the 15th through the 20th or somewhere in there where you might not see a deer for 3 days and then a giant might walk through at 2 in the afternoon
Yeah.
that you've never seen before. Um, especially if I'm thinking about going out to like a plain state or something. If I'm not able to go that October week, then I would almost skip the first week and go like the second week or maybe the third week in November instead.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel the same way. I was just ready to say there's some commonality there all the way down into Midwest and when I say plain states, I'm talking Nebraska. It's about as far as I've gone. But yeah, I feel the same way about that. I've for so long I took that first week of November off and just I mean it's okay. I've killed a lot of bucks during that time, but I just really feel like that second week or even that first week of October is a better time period. Um, okay. I want to be conscious of our time here too. So moving into late season, um, what is the strategy there?
Pray that you have snow and then find the pattern and like don't hunt it until you find the pattern. And I've been guilty of trying to hunt spots late season instead of trying to hunt the deer. And what I become better at over time is saying like I didn't like I'm just not gonna hunt today. I'm just gonna find out whatever's going on. And I might still bring my bow with me if I get out there early enough and say like if I find what I'm after, I'm gonna set up on it. But if I don't find that, I'm not obligating myself to actually like climb a tree and sit. I'll just end back up at the truck at, you know,
Mhm.
end of the day and I'll drive home and come back out the next day, scout someplace else. But what I've seen is that a lot of times the deer they'll get more congregated late. And if you are in one of those areas where you have a little bit bigger difference between the more open spots and the thicker spots, let's say if you got a little bit more open hardwoods, but then you've also got that alder swamp. Well, late season, when all of the cover is in that swamp, that's where you're going to find most of the deer. And so then you got to figure out, are they just feeding on the woody browse in there or are they feeding on something else? If you scout the outside perimeter and you see all the areas where deer are going in and out, and you see the quantity of the tracks, when the last snowfall was, You can see the size of the tracks. Might not even necessarily have to get trail camera photos. You can kind of do a little bit of analysis there and figure out if you think the deer are going to be moving where you can hunt them in daylight. Because it's hard to sneak close to beds that time of year for sure. And in some of those instances, if you've got, some counties you can bait. Some like Minnesota, my home state, you can't bait. Wisconsin depends on the county. Some counties you can bait, some counties you can't bait. But if somebody's baiting, then that could be influencing where the deer are moving throughout that time frame. And you got to figure out what's going on. And again, just not hunting until you figure out what's going on. And once you think you have a decent pattern figured out, you think you know what the deer are doing, or you've located the deer that you're after, then you start to plan your actual hunts.
Mm-hmm. Anything else before we exit the late season?
Don't be afraid to hunt mornings late season. It can, like, mentally it's brutal. But there's been places that I hunted, especially growing up, Wisconsin. This is not even necessarily what I would consider big woods, but several thousand acre marsh flat type habitat where I had way better success in December hunting in the mornings compared to in the evenings, where the deer were feeding so far away. They feed on private ag, and they would travel over a mile and a half to get back to their bedding. And so I was hunting, a mile and a quarter back. And by the time they finally filtered back, it was like an hour after sunup. And I had one really nice buck that came through, and I, screwed up and missed an opportunity. I was young at the time, but he was like right at like first light, and a lot of those other deer were, coming through much later. So it was like you could definitely get an opportunity in the morning as compared to the evening. You have the advantage of those deer are a long ways off, especially if they're feeding on something predictably. If they're just kind of generally browsing throughout the bedding area, that's different. But if you know that they're moving from A to B, then you can get in there as early as you need to and be set up for when those deer come back. And that might be a better opportunity than trying to sneak 200 yards to their bedding, which is as close as you can get, and then they don't even end up moving that far during daylight.
That is such a great tip and makes so much sense. It really does. Um, Anything that you wanted to say about Big Woods that I didn't ask or you didn't get a chance to talk about?
Hmm. Um, have fun with it. I've I've grown to enjoy hunting some of these bigger areas and a little bit more vast, and you feel like you can always scout and you don't always have it figured out, and you don't get glued to any one area. Have different expectations. It's not as easy to find bedding. It's not as easy to figure out patterns, but I feel like it can be super rewarding. And in some instances, depending on where you're at, you might even be better off trying to figure out a big woods pattern compared to hunting the 4 or 5 like better habitat areas that everybody's hunting because it has better habitat. So just keep an open mind when you're hunting those bigger woods.
Awesome. So, I think everybody knows who you are and knows where to find you, but just in case there's an outlier out there, where can people find you?
Yep. So on YouTube, if you look up DIY Sportsman, that's my channel on there. And then on Instagram, Facebook, it's just DIY_sportsman. I do have some older podcast episodes that can still be found on the Sportsman's Empire. I can't remember exactly the number I'd gotten up to, but I slowed down a little bit last year just because my schedule got a little bit too tight. But there's definitely a lot of old stuff there as well.
Yeah. And I mean, the YouTube channel is a ton of content, not just big woods, but I mean, you cover a lot of different terrain, really awesome map scouting, instruction videos there. And then I mean, creating DIY, um, gear and on all of that. Like one of the most informative, YouTube channels out there. I think it's one of the longest running, hunting content YouTube channels that I'm aware of, and it's one that I've watched for years and learned a ton from. So I'm sure most people know that it's there, but just in case they don't, you have to go check this one out. This is and I'm not just saying that, you really need to check this YouTube channel out.
Hmm. Oh, and one more plug I'll throw in there. Can't believe I almost missed this one. The Hunt Better platform
Hmm.
is pretty new. I've been doing some video editing and helping support Hunt Better platform, and the number of really skilled woodsmen and hunters that are on there either during live streams, or we do hunt breakdowns that are similar to like some of those older videos I've done where
Yeah.
we pick a specific deer, look at the map, watch the pins move around, and they explain how everything went down, but what the key takeaways were. Little field notes. There's a lot there. It is a subscription service, but guys, definitely feel free to check that out as well.
Yeah, and I feel like every once in a while there's like a freebie that comes out, or at least a portion
Yep.
of one. I think I watched
Yeah,
one.
there's.
What was there? Did you do one with Rindle Eric one time?
Yep.
You guys did like a duel. Yeah, that was awesome. I got to watch that. Man, I can't thank you enough. It was a lot of info. I really appreciate your time. You spent a lot of time with us today. And yeah, thanks so much. And I want to thank everybody else for coming out and coming to the dojo. We'll be back next Thursday with another Whitetail Master. We also have our 10-minute Tuesday. And until then, embrace the journey.